So welcome everybody. My name's John Beckford. I think virtually everybody knows me or knows who I am at this point. President of the Society, and this series of events is, as ever, designed to get two interesting people into a shared Zoom space, let each of them talk about the thing that excites them, and then see if we can synthesize anything interesting, anything further interesting out of it in the second part of the proceedings. So this month we've got Joe Dewhurst joining us from Munich and Carl Sachs joining us from Marymount University in the USA. I'm not sure where Marymount is, Carl.
It's a very small university. It's in Virginia.
Right.
So if you sort of find me on a map, I'd be roughly, I don't know, maybe about 40 to 50 kilometers west of Washington, D.C. Okay.
So that gives us a good idea of where you are. So welcome both. That's this month. So next month we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm delighted Angus is here because one of our new honorary fellows that we invited to become an honorary fellow this year, Carmen Hijosa, I think is pronounced. Is that Angus will correct me later. Angus is hosting Carmen next month, so we're looking forward to that as well. So more of that later in the afternoon. But for now, I'm going to ask Joe, and I've got your blurb here, Joe. I actually read it again earlier. So Joe Dewhurst is a postdoctoral fellow at the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy, working on topics to do with computation, mechanistic explanation, and formal approaches to causation and emergence in complex systems. Doctoral research at the University of Edinburgh, looking at the relationship between common sense intuitions and scientific theories. Another interruption. So that's what Joe is all about as a person, apparently, and he's going to talk about contemporary impact of cybernetic approaches in cognitive science. So, Joe, I shall say no more. Hand over the wand to you, and away you go. I'll give you a warning at 25 minutes if you're still going.
Sure, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. David actually found me searching for his own name on the internet, and I found David's website many years ago, and have been intrigued who this other Dewhurst might be. So it's great to finally meet him and to meet all of you. One thing my blurb didn't mention, I suppose, is my interest in cybernetics, I now realize, which came about from studying contemporary cognitive science and then getting interested in the history of cognitive science and, where it all started. And this got me interested in, of course, cybernetics, which I see as a kind of maybe somewhat forgotten or little known ancestor of contemporary cognitive science. So what I'd like to do today is to talk a little about that history, and I'll put my slides up now, and how it might inform contemporary cognitive science, so how it could be useful for us today, which is where my main interest is, although I find the history itself really fascinating. And the angle I'll have on this is basically that cybernetics, or some ideas from the cybernetic past, can help us to bring together two broad wings of contemporary cognitive science. So what we might call the computational tradition, the kind of mainstream computational tradition in cognitive science, and some of the anti-computationalist embodied or inactive traditions. Can everyone see my slides okay there?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. And so I'm calling this computers with bodies. So the idea here is that a positive route forward for contemporary cognitive science, which I think is stuck in some ways, would be to emphasize these two distinct aspects, so that cognitive systems are computational systems on the one hand, but that they're also embodied systems, and we need to take into account both of these aspects when we're studying them. And here it is that I think cybernetics has got a really rich history, and we can trace both of these kind of distinct research projects back to the history of cybernetics. So the first part of this talk will be somewhat historical. So I'll talk about these two twin origins in cybernetics, and this should be somewhat familiar to most of you. So my apologies if that bores you somewhat, but hopefully my spin on it will be somewhat different. And then I'll talk about what I mean by computers with bodies, and what these two different research traditions are, computationalist and anti-computationalist, and how we might be able to bring them back together by drawing on some cybernetic resources, and then sketch out what this might look like. Okay. So like I said, I think the cybernetic origins of cognitive science and contemporary cognitive science are somewhat forgotten and understudied. These are two notable exceptions, but in most histories of cognitive science, you probably won't even find the word cybernetics anywhere. It's just not mentioned. To some, well, nowadays I think this is because people just don't really know about cybernetics, or they think it's something weird to do with management studies or architecture or some other discipline that it's now grown into. Maybe in the 80s and 90s, there was a particular strand of cognitive scientists who were somewhat embarrassed by their cybernetic history. I'm sad to say, as seeing it as this kind of strange oddity. But I don't think we need to do that, and I think it's much more positive to actually think about it. So here I've just got Margaret Bowden's 2-volume Mind as Machine History of Cognitive Science, which doesn't say so much about cybernetics, but she does have one section, one chapter which talks about it in some detail. On the other hand, we've got Jean-Pierre Dupuis on the origins of cognitive science, all about cybernetics, and I think a really fascinating book, which I would highly recommend if you are interested in these connections between cognitive science and cybernetics. Dupuis' perspective on a bit of a tangent here is particularly interesting, I think, because he's actually very skeptical of the contemporary computational cognitive science project. So he brings this kind of outsider perspective on it, and some insights into why this might be a kind of misleading approach, but very interesting book. I would highly recommend. So what are these origins? There are two strands of this, as I said, one to do with the computational tradition and one to do with the embodied tradition. And I'll go through each of these in turn and say a little about them. Okay. So, this is just, sorry, some more history of just to give an overview for anyone who might be in the audience under my invitation and doesn't know so much about cybernetics. The cybernetics movement as such, I would say, emerged out of interdisciplinary research in the US during World War II and other places. So people from lots of different disciplines working together. In particular, people interested in problems of control, so how to control weapon systems in particular during the war, but also other kinds of problems. This led to the Macy conferences between 1946 and 1953, which were eventually termed the cybernetics conferences and brought together these people with lots of different background interests. So a few figures here we can see, if I get my little laser pointer up. It's quite a bad quality picture. I'm sure there's a better one somewhere. Warren McCulloch here, I believe Margaret Mead here. The others I can't make out so well, but a bunch of people. Von Neumann attended some of these conferences, among others. These, I suppose, fragmented by the mid 50s. People started going their own separate ways. But during this half decade, there was a lot of very vibrant ideas being discussed and passed around, and this led to lots of interesting research in different areas. The term cybernetics, I won't talk about so much here, was coined by Wiener, of course, in 1943 as the science of communication and control, something which I think is still very central to cognitive science today. So by the mid-50s, the cybernetics movement as such had begun to splinter and head in different directions. In 1956, we have another famous conference or workshop, the Dartmouth workshop, where the discipline known as AI or artificial intelligence was first kind of started, where it all came together. And I think, notably, there was some feedback there, a good cybernetic theme. Notably, very few participants from cybernetics conferences only 3 years earlier attended the Dartmouth workshop. So quite a different group of people, maybe with some different aims in mind, and not much discussion of the same ideas from cybernetics. And so Claude Shannon here would be a notable exception, I think. I'm not sure any of the other main attendees of the Dartmouth workshop on artificial intelligence were involved in the cybernetics conferences. This approach, this very kind of computational heavy approach of the Dartmouth workshop is probably one of the birthplaces of cognitive science, which then develops over the next few decades into a kind of coherent research program. Sometimes, again, so an interdisciplinary research program like cybernetics, sometimes linking together these 6 disciplines is a common way of framing it. So psychology, philosophy, linguistics, anthropology, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. So yeah, again, like cybernetics, big interdisciplinary program. Not much mention of the cybernetic history, though, in any of these disciplines, I would say, today. Anthropology is maybe a little bit of a kind of redhead stepchild here, who doesn't have so much to do with cognitive science for a lot of this period. And maybe where you would find some more cybernetic currents within cognitive science if it had been more closely involved. So people like Margaret Mead were very important in 20th century anthropology and had a strong interest in cybernetics. Gregory Bateson as well. So that may have could have been another way of getting cybernetics back into cognitive science. But I think by the 90s and certainly today, there isn't much knowledge or awareness of the cybernetic past of cognitive science, and this is something I'd like to try and change a bit. Okay, so the first of these connections here, computation, and 3 or 4 big figures here who were at least somewhat associated with cybernetics, maybe some more famously than others. Alan Turing, John von Neumann, and Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts. Walter Pitts over here. And I'll say a little bit about each of these. These figures are all more well known, I would say, in contemporary cognitive science, but their connections with cybernetics are less well known. And it's interesting to look back at this and look at the kind of influence they've had on cognitive science, in particular the idea of computation. So Alan Turing probably needs no introduction. Famous British scientist of the 20th century. In 1936, wrote this paper on the halting problem, where he posed the idea of the hypothetical idea of a Turing machine as a kind of abstract logical system which could carry out any computable function. It ends up being a somewhat circular definition because a computable function is just defined as a function computable by a Turing machine, but it's still a very interesting idea and has been incredibly important in lots of different areas of mathematics and computer science. Indeed, there wouldn't be computer science as we know it without this paper. This is a kind of schematized diagram of a Turing machine. So it's just an extremely simple device with a what's called a head, or a kind of a box, which reads a tape of what are essentially ones and zeros, so marks and blank spaces, and either writes a mark, deletes a mark, or moves the tape one way or the other. And just this extremely simple kind of system with some set of instructions can carry out what we would now think of as any computable function. So he, I think, here provided a very vivid illustration of the idea that we could mechanize what are previously thought of as intelligent operations. So logical or mathematical operations could be mechanized and performed in a kind of unintelligent manner. And this proved extremely important for what would become cognitive science, and particularly the computational tradition, because you then get the quite natural next thought that thinking as a kind of logical operation could be mechanized in this way, and thinking could therefore be understood as computational. And then if we can understand what kind of computation it is and how it's implemented, we'll be able to understand what thinking is. And then, if you're interested in the engineering side of this, you could make a thinking machine yourself. You could create an artificial intelligence. Turing's connection to cybernetics is probably less well known. He was a member of, or gave one talk for the Ratio Club, the kind of British cybernetics club during the 40s and 50s. We were talking about Craik earlier, and the president of the Ratio Club, I think, described it as a club for those who were doing cybernetics before Wiener invented the term cybernetics. So there's a kind of slight British chip on our shoulder feel here, that we were doing it first. We just didn't come up with the fancy name like the fancy Yanks did. But yeah, Turing was in the same circles as lots of the members of this club, who we'll come to later. Exchanged some interesting letters with Ross Ashby in particular, and gave at least one talk to the club. So not closely associated with it, but I think closely associated enough that we should think of him as a cyberneticist, or at least as much as many of these other figures. Some of his later work you might think of as moving in a kind of cybernetics type direction, or something I think is connected to that. So he has this very interesting later work on pattern formation, which begins to look at complex systems and the emergence of patterns out of very simple structures and this kind of thing, which I think is another kind of useful theme. So Turing I think of as a cyberneticist, and in many ways the founder of computational cognitive science. A very different character, John von Neumann in the US, attended several of the Macy conferences. So in that sense is associated with cybernetics, and among the many different things he was involved in, created the idea of what is now known as a von Neumann architecture, which is the kind of at least kind of architectural structure in now a more abstract sense, but originally a more literal sense of your desktop computer, and also went on to inform a lot of computational cognitive science. So this is a von Neumann architecture. So the idea is, rather than just the Turing machine, which only has this single tape to run along, you can structure things such that you have a control unit similar to the head of a Turing machine. These kind of logic units which just do basic functions, so core functions, and then a memory unit where you can draw up what are essentially different Turing tapes for different kinds of problems you need to solve. And this moves the kind of abstract idea of a Turing machine, which is in some sense not physically plausible, because it would take either or both too much room and too much time to compute these functions, into something which we can actually use and actually build. So you can see the shift to the von Neumann architecture as a way to make the idea of a universal computation from Turing into something real, something concrete. So the idea here is you give some input to this. The control unit works out what kind of input it is and what we want to do with it, and then gets up whatever instructions we need from a memory unit, and then uses the other functions to perform the computation, and then stores something back into memory and gives us some kind of output. This could be an output for us to read in text, or an output that controls some other system. So we don't need to just think of the computers we use, but you might think of a computer attached to a actuator such that it can actually do something in the world. And this again gets us closer to the idea of either artificial intelligence systems using this kind of architecture, or the idea that the human and other cognitive systems might also have this structure. And lots of classic work in computational cognitive science, I think we can see, is taking this general framework and trying to find where these bits are in the human brain. So if we think of a brain as a computer, we try to work out where the memory bits are, where the central processor is. People think maybe the frontal lobe kind of has this structure, where the different functions are carried out. This is maybe seen as a somewhat misguided approach, I would say, by some people today, who instead would look for what we would call an abstract machine in computer science, or a virtual machine. So rather than thinking there has to be a single place in the brain where there's a control unit, we might think of it as a kind of distributed network. But this idea that we want to kind of localize different specific functions corresponding in some way to computational functions is still very much present in contemporary cognitive science. So this would be another cybernetic forerunner of cognitive science. This might not look much like a cybernetic system to some people, but I think we still got this idea of it being used to control things. And one thing I'll get to later is, if you imagine a loop between output and input, we get something much more like a feedback system. So if a computational system like this is taking kind of sensory input from its environment, and also changing things in that environment, which it can also interact with and see, you get something much more like a feedback loop. And this I would like to suggest later on is how we should think about human computational cognition in a more kind of cybernetically informed fashion. Finally, we've got Warren McCulloch, very involved in the Macy conferences, and Walter Pitts, who was his kind of brilliant protege, quite a tragic life, if you're interested, look into that. But they published this paper on what's come to be known as the logical neuron, or the Warren McCulloch neuron. And this was looking at the physiological properties of neurons in the brain in quite an abstract sense, and modeling how they could work as very basic logic units. So roughly how a neuron works, or how they were modeling a neuron as working, is it takes a bunch of different kinds of inputs, so excitatory or inhibitory inputs, which raise a kind of electronic threshold in the neuron, and once this passes a certain threshold, the neuron fires, which means it sends an input or a signal to some other neuron. And even though this is modeled often as a kind of an analog system where you've got a gradual raising of the threshold, these still have the same abstract properties as binary or digital logic gates. So if you have a system which fires if it only gets one input from one direction, this can be performing something similar to an OR. Or if you have an input neuron which needs inputs from two directions, that might look like an and so on. So you can use these kind of analog or biological neurons, at least in principle, to build something at least formally equivalent to a digital computational system. So what you get from McCulloch and Pitts, I think, is at least the sketch of an idea of how to think about biologically plausible neurons as computational systems, and that's still very much a live research program in cognitive neuroscience. So, well, there's two parts to that. The people who think the brain is a computer really need something like this to be true, or else you're not going to have a plausible story about the implementation. But then on the other hand, you have people studying individual neurons and working out what their computational properties are like. And it turns out that they're much, much messier than the systems we use in a computer. So there's still a long way to go on that. But I think the idea that you can treat a kind of messy biological system as having some kind of abstract computational properties is a very valuable one that you get coming out here. Okay. So that's the computational part of the tradition there. Yeah, thanks, James. A link to a very interesting, that's Phil Husband's History of a Ratio Club, which is a very good one. Very interesting bunch of people. They had one talk about telepathy, which is notable, but that was very much a live idea back in the 50s as well. Okay, so I'll say a little bit about embodiment, and here we actually get back to some of the British cyberneticists who, I think, in contrast to the American cyberneticists, so von Neumann and Claude Shannon and Norbert Wiener were maybe more interested in the embodied and kind of engineering side of things. So I'll say a little here about Ross Ashby, Gray Walter, and not a British figure, Heinz von Förster here, who was important in what became known as second order cybernetics, which I think has had a more direct influence on some of the anti-computationalist cognitive science today. Cool. So Ashby's homeostat, again, something I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. This was just a kind of mechanical implementation of a homeostatic system. But so the idea, you have here pools of water inside here with current running through them, and you can set the dials to different levels, to different kinds of settings. And what he found interesting about it is you'll reach a kind of equilibrium where these reach some kind of steady state. And he explicitly intended this as a kind of very simple model of something like a cognitive system. So it seems to find its way towards this steady state. And this was how he thought about cognition, and how he thought about other kinds of behavior like that. There's an interesting exchange I mentioned earlier between him and Turing, where Turing says, Ashby, this is all well and good, but why don't you just simulate this on my big computer I've been building up in Manchester? And Ashby seems, I think, a bit exasperated, because I think to him this really misses the point. If you're just simulating something, you're not really understanding it. You need the actual physical body of it to understand it. I won't say much more about Ashby, but I think this idea of homeostasis is extremely important here. And another bit of Ashby's thought, the good regulator theorem, has informed some later work as well by some of the cybernetics, some of the modern people here today. How am I doing for time, John? I'm not quite sure when we started. Sorry, you're muted there. Yep.
8 minutes.
Okay, cool. I've run a little bit late there. Okay. I'll skip through some of this and get to what I actually want to talk about. Sorry, the history one on a bit. Walter's tortoises here. Just again, this is a kind of embodied robotic system. I did have a video to show you, but I'll send a link to it because I just really love this video. I think it's fantastic. And I won't show it to you though because we don't really have time. It's just a video. It's an old BBC video about Walter's tortoises, which I would recommend you all watch if you haven't seen it. Then we get to von Förster and second order cybernetics. And all I want to say about this is that it informs what becomes known as the enactivist tradition in cognitive science through the autopoietic theory of Maturana and Varela. So Maturana and Varela were Chilean cognitive scientists, or perhaps cyberneticists, who developed what was known as autopoietic theory, which envisioned a cognitive system as a kind of functionally closed system, which just reacted to perturbations from the environment. And what's important for the anti-computationalist tradition here is that this was seen not as a system which would represent its environment, but instead had its own kind of meaning wrapped up in its own homeostatic system here. Okay. So what I wanted to say about this is just that contemporary cognitive science, as I've mentioned a few times, has this emphasis on computationalism. So the idea here that we come up with a computational theory of how the mind works. We work out what this might be in algorithmic terms, and we work out how to implement it in the brain, for instance. There's another tradition inspired by both second-order cybernetics and Maturana and Varela's autopoietic theory, the embodied tradition, or the inactive tradition, which denies that this computational approach will work. And they deny that the computational approach works because it sees the mind then as a kind of passive receiver of inputs. So not an active agent in its environment, just this passive thing. So they emphasize this these kind of interactive loops between the environment. So they see cognition not just as a passive process of computation, but rather an active process of interaction with the world. And in particular, one thing they dislike a lot about computation and computational theories is the emphasis that they think, at least in the 90s, computational theories put on representation. So the idea that thinking is a process of representing things in the world. And I think to them, this introduces a kind of a split from the world. So there's this kind of epistemic boundary where we're closed off from the world and we're kind of stuck in our own little cinema representing it. And that's how they characterize computational theories of mind, as opposed to these embodied or inactive theories, which don't have that kind of boundary. Instead, we're in direct connection with the world. And the connection with cybernetics again here is that, you know, this is very easily seen as a kind of feedback loop, and this idea that there's this constant process of balancing our interaction with the world going on there. The main thing I really want to emphasize here is that there are these two strands present in contemporary cognitive science, so the computational and the embodied, or the anti-computational. But I think it's really a mistake to see these as being in opposition, and the mistake comes from this thought that computation has to be representational. So computational has to be a matter of kind of building a picture of the world and then processing internally on it. So yeah, that's just a picture of some kind of schematic picture of a computation. So I've written a bit about this, but won't talk about it so much today. There's a lot of contemporary research in philosophy of computation arguing that we don't need to think of computation in this representational way. So instead, we can think of computation as just the manipulation of these units, these digits or whatever, which don't have any inherent meaning. So the computation itself doesn't need to be seen as meaningful or as representational. And I think this means it doesn't need to introduce this division between us and the world. Instead, it can just be what's called a mechanistic explanation of what's going on internal to a system. And that mechanistic explanation, I think, isn't going to be the full picture of what cognition is or how cognition operates. Instead, it just gives us one half of the picture, the kind of internal bit. Whereas the external bit might be something else. I'll skip that on this. That's just a nice artificial life picture. The only reason I included that, I won't say much about it, is just that I think it gives a very vivid illustration of how something complex and emergent and creative can come from very simple computational rules. So this is just, each of these cells just either dies or expands depending on these very simple rules, and yet we can get something looking like life from it. So I think this idea that computation and life or cognition might be separate is a mistake there. Okay. In the final few minutes, I'll just say a bit about some contemporary traditions in cognitive science, which I think draw on this cybernetic past in a more interesting way, and I think are valuable to look at. This is Rodney Brooks, Anil Seth, and Cal Friston. Rodney Brooks so in the 90s, he was doing this work on embodied robotics, and he's still pursuing this in a private enterprise now. iRobot, I think his company was called last. And he had this very interesting idea of a subsumption architecture, which is a computational or robotic system, but rather than explicitly representing rules about the world, just follows these very basic sets of instructions. So, unless it's told to do something else, it will wander around. But then, when it gets a sonar signal of something in its environment, it will try to avoid it. And you get much more emergent behavior here, not based on any explicit rules, but rather just these different kinds of interactions of internal parts of the system. And I think his robots, I think, are somewhat inspired and very reminiscent of Gray Walter's robots, like Elsie and what the other one was called. And have this kind of emergent quality to them. And I think this way of thinking about computation and robotics is quite an interesting one when we're thinking about what kind of natural cognition might be like, and is going to be much more fruitful than the kind of strict rules-based approaches of more classical artificial intelligence. Some of the contemporary robots, like that we see Boston Dynamics doing, the big dog and so on, I think they have more explicit rules-based systems, but they're also using features of their embodiment in a useful way. So, for instance, by having slightly non-rigid limbs, you can save a lot of computational power because you don't need to work out exactly where the limb should be because there's some give in it. So this idea that some aspect of internal computation can be offloaded onto the body as well is something coming back into some of contemporary cognitive science. So both Anelsev...
You need to be winding up fairly shortly, Joe.
Cool. So just to end then, just so that I won't say anything about this, Anelsev and Carl Friston then are both working within this active inference framework, which is draws some explicit inspirations from cybernetics, and again emphasizes ideas like homeostasis and interaction with the world. So seeing cognition not as a matter of passively receiving input and computing over it, but rather trying to come into some kind of equilibrium or balance with the world, closer to the idea of a cybernetic system. Yeah, finally, just to sum up this, so I think we have these two different traditions which, with a kind of cybernetic vision, could come back together. So on the one hand, computation or mechanistic approaches, which excel at explaining the internal structure and workings of complex systems, like the brain or like cognition, and embodied and active approaches, which excel at explaining the interactions between a system and the world, and maybe even how meaning can arise from those interactions. So Vina's early paper here on the feedback loop as a kind of source of meaning, I think, is interesting in this regard. And I think looking back to the cybernetic tradition for contemporary cognitive scientists can help us synthesize these two kinds of rival approaches. So I'll just sum up there. That's a paper about from some ardent computationalists pushing this kind of line as well. I think that we can bring these things back together. Cool. So I'll sum up there. Thanks very much.
Wow. So if you unshare, Joe, so we can see a few more faces.
Yes, I will do. Let me just go to do that. There we go. Got it. Yep.
As ever, everyone, the slides and the talks are being recorded, and we'll get it up onto YouTube as soon as we can for proper sharing, because there was quite a lot in there, Joe.
Yes, sorry, it was a little bit of a rush.
Well, so for something you told me an hour ago was only going to take a few minutes, I think you romped along very nicely. I'm struck. One thing for those of you who don't know, we have invited Margaret Bowden to become an honorary fellow of the society.
That's excellent.
The suggestion of our members this year. I'm currently waiting for a response from her. She is 86 or something, I think. So it may take a while for that to come back. I was struck earlier on in your talk, you were talking about the fragmentation of the science and the fragmentation of cybernetics. I wonder if you have a sort of perspective on how or why that might have come about, Joe.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's lots of different theories about this, as I'm sure you know. I think there's a couple of reasons. So the more pragmatic one is basically just that it failed to find a single kind of institutional home. So there was this push to, having a clear identity such that you could apply for funding and so on. And while it had the support of the Macy Foundation in the US, it was able to do a lot there, and there was some government money for that. But once that had gone, it was harder to maintain the momentum. And just for pragmatic reasons, people had to decide, actually I'm a neuroscientist, or actually I'm a computer scientist, or whatever. I think beyond that though, one thing that I'm struck by looking at the transcripts from the Macy conferences is just that there was a lot of miscommunication. I think in some ways it was a slightly too ambitious kind of project, and lots of people coming in had different ideas what they wanted it to be. So some people were interested in looking at economic and social and international politics as a kind of cybernetic system and how to understand that. Whereas some people were really just interested in working out how the brain works. And it was hard for these different kinds of people to talk to each other. So this isn't to say that there's no relationship between these ideas, because I think there definitely is. It's just maybe when you were originally trying to put these ideas forward, it would have been helpful institutionally to have a clearer sense of what the focus of it was meant to be. And this idea of a general theory of control was maybe ahead of its time. I do think that at least some of the spirit of this has maybe survived in complexity theory. So places like the Santa Fe Institute for Complexity, I think, managed to maintain this idea that there are commonalities between different kinds of complex systems, different kinds of control systems, so that we might be able to take ideas from how to study the brain and apply them to how to study societies or something. And the spirit of that still is alive today, I would say, in at least some areas.
Thanks. So, anybody else got a quick question for Joe at this point, emerging from that talk? Anybody?
I was going to maybe just, I think jump in for a minute to build on Joe's response for a moment. I think the history is kind of interesting. So everything Joe said about why cybernetics sort of dissipated, I think is right, and I think I like that his point about is an idea a bit too big for its britches, at least at the time. And also at the point of warning, I think it's also worth just noting that after World War II, the big push in funded research in the States was towards basic science, towards like you had to have a discipline. And so while during the war, there was government funding for interdisciplinary research during World War II. But then the funding priorities of the government shifted. And so without that, you couldn't have a digital home if you did this kind of wide-ranging work. So that was a big part of it too. So it's not just about the project; it's also about how the government saw its responsibilities about the kind of research they were going to commit themselves to.
That's cool. That's really helpful. It always makes me think that I get cross that we have nuclear reactors generating power that are made with uranium rather than thorium, and because all the money went on the military and not on the civil. And there's a sort of
yes.
The money follows the military might to some extent is an unhelpful way of the world working. But
I think that's right. I mean, it's also worth pointing out to add something that Joe pointed out. The Dartmouth conference chose artificial intelligence and not cybernetics, because by that time, Wiener had really demanded that his fingers be involved in everything involving cybernetics. But he refused to accept anything with defense funding. By this point, he was a pacifist. And so he kind of poisoned a lot of funding research for a lot of people because they couldn't get the DoD funding if he was involved. But he insisted being involved in everything involving the name Cybernetics. And so artificial intelligence became this name that then was used to advance Cybernetics-like projects and get DoD funding and get DARPA funding without involving Wiener.
It's always difficult in this country. I think the problem still exists these days. Now, anybody else want to come in briefly? Any question? Augustus.
Hi, Joe. Good to finally meet you, even if it is digitally. Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to know. So I'm familiar with Piccinini. I've read his parts of that book a long while ago. But I'm not really aware of what the kind of inactivist response has been to this, right? So if the problem really is about representation and computation can be done without representation, then are a lot of the inactivists now on board with having a more computational approach as long as it's embodied? I've certainly heard that some people who you might have heard of in the, who are related to Carl Friston think that, we can now, since Piccinini kind of made this great argument, we can now, combine computationalism and inactivism. I've heard that one before. Yep. But I'm not sure what the inactivists think.
So I actually have a series of articles with Mario Villalobos, who's a Chilean researcher who actually first introduced me to cybernetics. So he's a disciple of Maturana, so sees himself not as an activist, but as a kind of true autopoietic theorist. But we've argued precisely that inactivists shouldn't be scared of computation for this reason, that they should be happy to use computational techniques and models and so on. I think within the inactivist tradition, there's also some differences here. So as you said, the people working on active inference nowadays are very happy to do this, but they only have a very loose commitment to their entities. I would say they're not, if they can model it, they're not really so concerned about the kind of more strong metaphysical commitments. Lots of the other inactivists are very happy to use computer models. So you can obviously model these systems, but then that's different from a system actually being computational. So it's quite a kind of subtle distinction, but you might model the brain using computer models, but not think that the brain itself is carrying out computations. So some of them would draw the line there. Whereas, yeah, I think they should be happy to accept the brain is also performing computations. It's just that these are quite minimal, non-representational computations. I'm not sure many of them have accepted that, but I've tried to convince them. I have a few papers arguing that.
Thank you.
So, very quickly, James, quick one from you, and then we will move on to our second speaker.
Yeah, just chiming in on the sort of decline thing, reading the Ashby Club, the Ratio Club stuff, it struck me that it only seemed to be the Ashby that was really driving cybernetics as a discipline, whereas the others all seem to be using it as a toolkit. Yeah. And they went off down their own particular interests using cybernetics to kind of unpack it and make some fantastic steps forward. But toolkit, and when they'd done that little bit of all getting together and churning over cybernetics, they all went off down their own sort of little avenues. Did that happen in the US as well, or was it just it sort of managed to anneal more in the USA?
So I do think some of it survived in other areas, and a more positive way of seeing the death of cybernetics is seeing, as you say, people taking toolkit parts of it to apply in their own disciplines, and they maybe stop using the term cybernetics. But yeah, I think Carl maybe gave some good indications of why cybernetics as a unified whole died out. But people like von Neumann, with some interest in cybernetics, continue to be hugely influential, maybe because they would accept DoD funding and use it to create robots and so on. But yeah, I don't think, Carl, there wasn't really kind of a longer running cybernetics movement that survived. So there's things like von Förster's work, which then develops into something still called cybernetics a bit later on in the 80s, but that's a somewhat different kind of current, I would say.
Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for the questions, everybody. We will come back to all this very shortly. In the meanwhile, and again, second person I'm meeting for the first time, so I'm delighted to welcome Carl Sachs. Carl's an associate professor of philosophy at Marymount University, USA, which I've established now is in Virginia, 45 miles or thereabouts west of Washington.
I checked. I was mistaken. It's only 10 kilometers.
Okay, 10 kilometers, but if it was east, which was what going in my head, it would be a very wet university. So it is just as well it is west. He works on American pragmatism and the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory and Philosophy as Mind. So what Carl is going to talk to us about tonight is Wilfrid Sellars as philosopher of cybernetics, often using examples of guided missiles or robots in speculative scientific metaphysics of mind. So at which point, again, I am going to shut up and invite Carl to take the floor and explain all that to me, please, Carl. You've got half an hour to convince the audience.
Well, should be easy enough. I put a link in the slide and the chat for you, as you can follow along. But let's see here. Let's sort of share my screen with you. Okay. So here's Wilfrid Sellars, 1912-89. I'm going to start with a few overview, because I imagine most of you have no idea who this person is or why you should even care about him. So I'll give an overview, sort of talk about his project, and try and move into the cybernetic connection fairly quickly. I should point out that Sellars does have a little bit of a following among philosophers, both in the States, in the UK, and in Europe. but the idea that cybernetics was in any way important to his project is the thesis, a very particular thesis that I've been promoting and trying to publish and work on. So this is not a standard reading, but perhaps a correct one. So a little basic background, his major philosophical influences can be divided into two main groups, sort of the grand representatives of the sort of philosophical tradition of, Kant, Hegel, Charles Sanders Peirce, John Dewey. It was also very much influenced by the logical positivists and ordinary language philosophers of his own time. Russell, Carnap, Ryle, and Wittgenstein, all important philosophers for him. Among his major works, starting with noting Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind from 1956, very well-known essay that's been, much published and republished with commentaries, where he has appears in the reading assistant graduate programs around the world, and also his work Science and Metaphysics from 1967, both of which I should point out were lectures he gave in the UK. He's sort of trying, he's just wanted to, try and, pander to my audience here. Okay, so core commitments. I want to suggest that the following are the central commitments for Sellars' entire project. One core commitment is to a version of naturalism. That's to say, committing to the idea that human cognitive and rational powers, however they're characterized, have got to be in some sense continuous with the kinds of preconceptual patterns of behavior that we see in animals and other, life forms. So there's no magical, there's no magic, there's no jumps, there's nothing about human beings that's spooky, otherworldly, supernatural, what have you. He's also committed to a certain version of empiricism, although it's a version that he develops throughout his work in rather unusual ways, in part because he develops it through a criticism of the logical empiricists or logical positivists. So he is critical of some of their ideas in many ways, but critical in ways that end up contributing to the project of empiricism, which I want to characterize in this kind of flat-footed dumb way as the idea that all of the cognitive contact the mind has, all of the friction that the mind has with the world, comes about through modifications of sensory consciousness. And that actually becomes very important because it helps fuel his commitment to nominalism, right? The view that however important universals or generals might be, however important we might have universals such as triangularity or dogness or what have you, whatever your universals or general terms might be in a particular language, those terms do not function to indicate how the mind forms into contact with the world, but rather the mind's contact with the world is only and explicitly at the level of concrete particulars. Abstracta are not real, generals are not real, only concrete particulars are where the cognitive rubber hits the road. And that is another important implication that reality does not have any categorical or propositional form at all. That whatever category or propositional structure there is in our thoughts about the world is entirely from the contribution the mind makes to experience and not what the world is bringing to bear. So these are some pretty demanding commitments of Sellars's, and one thing that makes Sellars a bit peculiar is that Sellars also tries to accept a great deal from Immanuel Kant, who does not in any way share those commitments. Sellars' project is very much one of trying to trying to combine these two different commitments that are really, on the face of it, quite incompatible. Ideas he inherits from the American naturalistic tradition, as well as commitments he inherits from Kant, and trying to put those together. And one of my main thesis, interpretive claim here, is that for Sellars, cybernetics plays a very important role in how those two ideas are to be sort of married together without total confusion. So what he inherits from Kant? First of all, he inherits the idea that sensibility, our capacity to be affected by objects, is a distinct capacity from our capacity to judge according to rules. The idea that the understanding, our capacity to judge according to rules, our capacity to use concepts, is fundamentally a normative capacity. That to judge is, or to have a concept, to use a concept, is to think according to a rule, right? The concept is just the rule that applies to the use of that word in whatever language one happens to be speaking. And so conceptual thinking is then fraught with ought, to use one of Sellars' phrases, including ought to be's as well as ought to do. So we're using ought in a very liberal sense, not just what one ought to do, but also ought in the sense of what ought to be the case. And Sellars has a complicated theory of normativity on why ought to be's and ought to do's have to both be part of the picture. He also has a great deal to say about the role of the productive imagination, a Kantian term. And in his theory of experience, Sellars ends up developing an idea that when that perception involves the construction of what he calls image models, which are constructed through a combination of these bottom-up sensory receptiveness combined with a kind of top-down recipes, as he calls it, provided by our concepts. And I've tried arguing at some in a recent paper that what Sellars is up to here is actually very similar to what we see in the sort of predictive processing story developed by Friston and by Seth and by Jacopowi and Andy Clark and many others. I am probably less enthused by the story now than I was when I wrote that paper. But I think something like that is going to be important for understanding what Sellars is up to in his theory of mind. So given this Kantian background, Sellars disagrees with Kant in several major ways. And these are the two in particular I want to focus on for understanding why Sellars would then want to be interested in cybernetics. One is that, unlike Kant, Sellars thinks that scientific realism, the idea that our scientific theories should be understood as moving as sort of an asymptotic approximation to the fundamental structure of reality. That's a very Peircean thought that Sellars takes up, and he recognizes that if we're going to have a story like that, then we can't be pure Kantians. We can't think that science is restricted to phenomenal knowledge only. He also thinks, again, against Kant, that the basic categorical framework the mind has for interpreting the world is not innate, right? If you read Kant, you read the Critique of Pure Reason, you might be inclined to say, well, okay, we've got these categories, that's great. Where do they come from? And Kant just says nothing at all about that. He has no genetic story. It's a purely transcendental account. Later philosophers did try and build genetic component into a Kantian story. Jean Piaget, the well-known psychologist, called his psychology a genetic epistemology. He did think he was trying to do a kind of story about how categories emerge through psychological development. That's really not a Kantian story. But Piaget's account is the kind of thing Sellars would have found very interesting, because Sellars follows Carnap and Wittgenstein and Ryle in thinking that the categories are themselves fundamentally sociolinguistic structures. And as such, the categories are acquired in the process of learning a first language. So the categories can't be innate. And this means that at some point in the story, Sellars recognizes there has to be room for something that is cognition or cognition-like, but which is not categorically structured in the way that normal adult human cognition is. So Sellars has to say the Kantian story might be right for, us philosophers reflecting on the nature of thought, but that can't be the whole story. There has to be room somewhere on our account for the kind of cognition that is good enough at reliably detecting patterns that it can detect patterns of linguistic usage and then glom onto those patterns and extract the kinds of regularities so they can sort of figure out what the categories are. So this then leads to the next big part of the story, which is how I want to read Sellars as naturalizing Kant with cybernetics. And I think the big concept Sellars gets from cybernetics is the concept of feedback loops. I think this is, in a way, what I take to be the Rosetta Stone for Sellars' philosophy, and I'll explain more about why I take it that way. Now, it's worth pointing out what exactly did Sellars read of cybernetics and when did he read it? There's a lot of research here that I have yet to do and that really no one has yet done. All I can tell you is that so far is that there are some cybernetic texts in the Sellars archive at the University of Pittsburgh. We know that he owned a copy of Wiener's Cybernetics book, and we also know that he owned a copy of this very interesting 1952 symposium, Mentality in Machines, with Wisdom, McKay, and Spilsbury. So he very likely could have read other cybernetics texts before and after these, but these are the ones we know occurred in his own personal library. So I want to use a lot of Wiener in this talk, because I think Wiener is an interesting philosopher in his own right. I think he's sort of an interesting philosopher, mathematician. His own philosophical works have been kind of neglected, but before he was doing much mathematics, he was publishing philosophy, and he has like several pieces on theories of knowledge and metaphysics that are kind of interesting in their own right. He certainly studied a lot of philosophy. He studied with Josiah Royce briefly. He studied with Russell and with Dewey. He was certainly a slouch when it comes to major philosophical issues. And I think it comes out here and there in his understanding about how to present cybernetics in his role as a public intellectual, in particular in the human use of human beings. So in this, in his 48 cybernetics text, he says this interesting thing when to say like the big breakthrough of cybernetics is taking seriously the ontology of information. Like information is not just is a category that we have to use in making in any metaphysics that science gives us, right? Any scientific metaphysics that we're going to have has to be one that takes information very seriously. He has this remarkable claim. I guess these are claims from later that pick up on nicely on what Joe was saying a moment ago, right? So the central nervous system is not this self-contained organ. It is engaged in its ongoing reciprocal relationships with its environment. It's engaged in a kind of circular causality with its environment. It's probably worth pointing out that before the Macy conferences, at first I believe were called the Macy conferences in circular causality and teleological mechanisms. And that was actually the name for the conferences. Then Weiner coins the term cybernetics in his work, And then Heinz von Foerster suggests that they use the word cybernetics to refer to the Macy conferences. So the concern throughout the entire period is with the concern of circular causality, not as a linear A causes B causes C causes D kind of thing, but rather circular causal processes. And that thinking of circular causality as a way to give us a mechanistic theory of teleological phenomena. I think that's sort of very central to what the cyberneticists thought they were doing. I think it comes out very clearly in Weiner's 43 paper, Behavior, Purpose, and Teleology. Whether they really were doing that, I think, is a fascinating open question. Whether they succeeded in doing that is another question, but I think they were very clearly attempting to do that. And that plays into a very important role in how they think what they're doing as developing mechanistic systems, or mechanistic in a very broad sense, systems that can be in a kind of continual interaction with their environments. And so in this picture, there is not much room for much internal storage or internal representation. As long as there's enough, there has to be only enough, as long as enough structure in the central nervous system to be able to sort of monitor and keep track of the regularities, you can generate all the intelligent behavior the way you want to generate. I think this is then important for what Sellars wants to do. Sellars has a distinction between what he calls signifying and picturing. And this has caused a lot of confusion among Sellarsians, because what he means by signifying is tolerably clear, but what he means by picturing is very opaque. What he means by signifying is how we conceptualize the relationship between thought and the world. So when we do phenomenology, we do knowing language philosophy, we're writing, we're doing our philosophy of language, we're producing sentences of the sort, snow is white if and only if snow is white, if we're sort of following our Tarski and T schemas. Well, you know, just trying to sort of explicate within language what we take the thought world relationship to be like. And many philosophers have been doing that before Sellars and after and since. And Sellars has just basically takes that for granted. He says, well, you know, for that kind of thing, Carnap and Wittgenstein, they basically get it. We don't really need to elaborate on that too much. But Sellars says, following that line of thought means that we cannot appeal to language to ground the connection between thought and the world. What we need is something quite different. What we need is to understand how thought and the world are not merely conceptualized as connected, but to understand how they really are connected. And this is where Sellars introduces the term picturing. And this leads to some puzzles, because he borrows this term from the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus by Wittgenstein. And this causes all sorts of interpretive problems and puzzles, in part because people who read the Tractatus without knowing where Wittgenstein gets this term from, then get into interpretive troubles. Because if you, Wittgenstein gets this term from the philosopher of physics, Heinrich Hertz, I think it was. I think it was Heinrich Hertz. Sort of interesting, one of those interesting German polymaths. And Hertz uses picturing to refer to how diagrams and blueprints work. So it's an interesting part where, and Wittgenstein is in many ways trying to combine Hertz with Frege. So here's Wittgenstein building on this tradition of scientific diagrams as picturing, and trying to think about how signs and propositions picture in that kind of way. But then that's a dimension of Wittgenstein's project that Sellars picks up and then runs with. But he adds a very important component to the Wittgensteinian picture that Wittgenstein lacks, and that's the concept of feedback loops. In the Tractatus, picturing is basically static. And so he will actually use fairly static examples of picturing, such as a sheet of music pictures the song or the melody. And what Sellars wants to do is think about picturing in much more dynamic feedback loop driven terms. And that's where I think we see Sellars appropriating cybernetics. So here's a bit of text from Sellars from his 1960 article, Being and Being Known. Page numbers are from the edition in his collection, Science, Perception, and Reality. So here he says, there's an isomorphism, a direct mapping between intellect and the world, but it happens, as it were, in two different registers. In the intellectual or logical order, as we reflect on the nature of thought from within it, but also in the real world, in the real order, when we're thinking about what minds are actually doing as they track their environments. And it's the confusion between these two ideas that's actually led, Sellars claims, to a great deal of confusion. And he is actually pretty, he does not hold back at all. He basically wants to claim the entire Western tradition has been confused ever since Aristotle and Plato because of a failure to make this proper distinction between these two different ways in which it makes sense to say that the intellect is related to the world. To make clear what he means to say the intellect is related to the world, he gives us this hypothetical experiment. Suppose an anthropoid robot of the future, this is the example he gives in 1960, is wired in such a way that it can explore its environment through a kind of, it says emits a high frequency radiation. So, you know, he's thinking about like how, so something like a combination between a submarine and a bat, right? Something instead of emitting radiation to the environment, receiving these profiles back from its environment, and then using that to build up a cognitive map of what's going on. Just an aside, it's worth pointing out that Sellars almost certainly was familiar with Edward Tolman's work on cognitive maps. The phrase cognitive map had been coined by Tolman in 1948, and Sellars was almost certainly familiar with those ideas. So Sellars was almost certainly influenced by a lot of stuff coming out of cutting-edge behaviorism, as well as by cybernetics. So we can imagine a robot wandering into the environment and having engaged in these sort of perceptual uptakes, and then using uptakes to sort of make inferences about what to expect, and then navigating its environment in ways that then lead to new novel perceptual uptakes. And in doing so, it is acting in ways that are genuinely epistemic, right? Or ways that could be described in epistemic terms, right? It is coming to learn more about its environment. It's coming to know more about its environment. It's coming to build an increasingly adequate map of its environment. And it's doing so through epistemic operations that we have no trouble calling induction and inference and abduction when we do it. So this robot is, you know, a fully fledged epistemic agent in roughly the same sense that we are, even though what it's doing can be cashed out entirely in mechanistic terms. So, you know, we could describe what it's doing in epistemic terms, but we could always drop down to the level of the electrical engineer and describe simply what's happening at the level of its, you know, at the computational level.
About 5 minutes, Carl.
Okay. So we picture in just the same way, and this is one of my smoking guns, because this is actually the only reference to cybernetics in anything published by Sellars I've yet seen. But he says, what we know from cybernetic theory is that the central nervous system is picturing for us in the same way that the robots' computational systems are picturing for it. So since I have 5 minutes left, I'm going to move past a couple of slides. I do have some quotes from Daniel Williams, recent paper of his, where he's trying to look to predictive processing as giving us a new notion of representation that might get past the representation wars between the strong representationalists that Joe talked about versus the strong anti-representationalists, the inactivists. And so I think insofar as what Williams is doing here, as well as other work that Joe and others have been doing, so there's a real interest in a kind of representation that is not linguistic, is not propositional, and I think that's actually what Sellars was already getting at in his work in the 1960s. So I think we work by Lezutuski and Williams and Colling on second-order structural representations, I think give us a nice way of understanding how to make sense of picturing as a causally grounded cartographic relationship between states of the cognitive system and features of the environment which are affecting that system. I want to now conclude in my last few minutes with the question, should Sellars have been a second-order cybernetician? Because he has this interesting big claim from the end of his essay, Philosophy and Scientific Image of Man, that we need to somehow join the scientific and manifest images. The image that we have, the world we get from the sciences, has to be joined with our ordinary, sort of practically, reflectively informed self-conception. And the way to join these two images, he ends up saying, is by construing, whatever he means by that, the actions that we intend to do and circumstances in which we intend to perform them directly in scientific terms. We relate to the world directly in science and make it the scientific world our world and no longer an alien appendage to the ordinary world in which we act. But I wonder, first of all, how it is that our actions and circumstances could be construed in cybernetic terms, but also seems to me that if Sellars taking this idea very seriously means that Sellars should have taken the turn from observed systems to observing systems, and that he should have followed von Filster much more in taking the turn towards second-order cybernetics. And I find it interesting that Sellars doesn't take that, and I just wonder, is that a blind spot in his own thinking? Is he just it just didn't occur to him? Should he have taken phenomenology more seriously than he already did? Or how deep does this blind spot go in Sellars' own thinking? And that's something I'm actually working on right now. Okay. Fini.
Wow.
I know that was really fast.
You did have 30 seconds left, Carl.
Oh my gosh.
Which you've put to complete waste at this point, so we're sort of kind of distraught at this end. So Joe, you've got your hand up straight away, so why don't you just lead off with a question?
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Carl. Really fascinating and really good to hear. So what I was wondering about, and you kind of got to this at the end, is when he's got this sketch of this robot moving around doing things, he begins with terms like inferences and so on in these almost kind of scare quotes, and then those kind of drop away. So what I'm wondering is how literally we need to take this more kind of representational or like picturing type talk, and then you got on to the manifest and the scientific, and this is exactly how I tend to think of it. I'm quite intrigued by this approach, is that there's a scientific mechanistic image on the one hand, and this manifest image with representations and meaning and so on the other, and they're kind of distinct things. So your suggestion with the second order cybernetics at the end there might be that Sellars wants to bring these together more than someone like me might want to. Is that right? Would that be fair to say?
I think so. Yes, I think that Sellars is I think in many respects a little bit of an old-fashioned philosopher, because he wants a single picture in which everything makes sense. He is not happy with pluralism that's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. He sees the attraction of pluralism, of course, but at the end of the day, he doesn't want to just be a pluralist. He wants a comprehensive picture. He's a little bit old-fashioned in that regard. He's not a postmodernist. Now, as for the scarecrows, right, this is I have a whole story about this, and I'll try and be kind of brief, which is hard for me. So he starts out with the scarecrows, and then I sort of drops them, and so like, what's up with that? So I think on my reading of Sellars, the reason why those terms are in scarecrows is because the robot is not a member of a discursive community. It's not engaging in the kinds of reciprocal interactions that have been nicely explicated by Brandom in his work, and so on. That's absent. The robot is just a kind of almost Robinson Crusoe-like figure. And I think without the intersubjective corrections, epistemic terms can only be in scarecrows because they they're only fully realized when they're there. But I do think that there's a lot of stuff in Sellars, particularly I think at the end of being known, and in other things he writes, in Inference and Meaning, and other texts, where Sellars basically says the function of these terms like means and signifies and so on, the function of those terms is to get our picturings coordinated. So we could start using, once we start interacting with the robot, well, robot, what did you learn today? And in the course of then successive feedback loops between us and the robot, we then progressively bring the robot into our discursive community. At that point, the scarecrows drop away.
Yeah, great. That's really fascinating. Actually reminds me of some of the activists who are happy with a kind of social or linguistic representation, but not this kind of basic mechanistic representation or something. So it seems like a somewhat similar idea.
I think so. I think that ultimately my story is going to be that linguistic propositions or content or meaning, or whatever you want to call it, is enacted, and I mean that in the full sense, enacted through iterated picturing cycles. So the picturing is representational, but it's representational in a very, very anodyne sense. It is, in a way, I think, I guess in a way I see Sellars as basically trying to tell the kind of story that Dan Hutto and Eric Mine are trying to tell in their stuff, right? How do you actually bootstrap covariance into content? And you do it through these iterative feedbacks.
I'm going to intrude at this point because John, I don't know whether you're a Doherty or a Doherty, John, but whichever.
I'm
would
so
you
sorry.
like to come in with your question, and you're on mute at the moment.
I'm a Doherty, actually. Thank you. So thank you for the talk. This is fascinating and not a part of Sellars that I've thought about. I wanted to ask whether you could say something about tension that I feel between the nominalism you mentioned at the beginning, the idea that reality doesn't sort of come propositionally structured, with the sort of idea of picturing that he's taking from Wittgenstein, right? Because in the TLP, reality is propositionally structured, and the picturing is like a way to talk about that without saying, but it seems like here, Sellars wants to deny the propositional structured reality. And so I was wondering, I feel a tension between his use of the picturing in the way that you were talking about and the nominalism, and I was wondering whether you had a way for me to resolve that feeling.
Well, I do, but not one you'll be happy with.
Okay.
Because I think you're absolutely right that Sellars is a nominalist, and he's when he talks about picturing, he is very, he wants to sort of, he's actually pretty clear in saying it's like Wittgenstein, only it really isn't, because the picturing the not only because the pictured items are objects, but also the picturing items are objects, what he calls natural linguistic objects. The items that are doing the picturing are themselves objects that are themselves basically neurophysiological states. So the isomorphism is not between propositions conceived of as Freudian senses and facts, whatever those really are. But it's much more, it's a completely naturalistic, materialistic transposition of that relationship into features of the environment and neurophysiological states. I think one of the big problems, and I think a stumbling block for a lot of people, including yourself, and for me too, is just why Sellars even used this term when his use of it is quite frankly rather perverse compared to Wittgenstein. And the best I can tell you there is I think he felt the need for some term that would do the work of cognitive friction between mind and world. And he thought that talking about the structure of language would not do that. And so he sort of uses picturing based on his reading of based on his reading of TLP. It's as if he's sort of saying, well, Wittgenstein uses the word picturing to mean cognitive friction between mind and world that is not itself represented within the structure of language.
That's really helpful.
And so that's why I think that's why he justifies using that word.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to come in again. So August, you've got your hand up again. Another question. Come on in.
Thank you, Carl. I just love all of this stuff, as you know. And I'm wondering if Sellars ever paid attention to teleology, or is there ever interested in the cybernetic interest in teleology? And there's a reason why even if he wasn't, why he probably should have been, because from my understanding of the third critique, and again, I don't know if you read the third critique, one of the big divides, or teleology is a problem when it comes to the divide between nature, Kant's scientific image of nature, and the realm of reason. And teleology, the natural purposes of organisms don't really seem to fit in the scientific image. And so there seems to be this interesting problem that might be mirrored in, that Sellars could have taken seriously as well. And he could have also felt like there was a solution in cybernetics, because if you take seriously the idea that cybernetics shows how we can bring teleology as into the realm of the scientific image, then that kind of problem that was originally set out in the third critique is kind of resolved in a way that kind of seems to parallel the way Sellars is trying to resolve a lot of the problems between mind and world. So I don't know if he went that direction, but it's interesting to think about how he could have.
Okay, so first of all, he does not. In fact, I've asked a number of Sellars scholars over the years if Sellars anywhere mentions the third critique, and to the best of our knowledge, he does not.
Oh, okay.
Which itself is pretty surprising, because he does write extensively about the first and second critiques. But if he does even mention the third critique, no one knows where it might be.
Right.
So that right there is actually a really interesting and pretty significant lacuna in Sellars, even as a Kant scholar. That said, I think you're exactly right, August, that the Sellarsian project simply does not even work without some way of taking teleology seriously. It can't work. I think that what Sellars wants the word behavior to do can't work without taking teleology seriously. And I think I've mentioned this to maybe mentioned a few of you over the years. So I mentioned very briefly this interesting psychologist, Edward Tolman, who is working on cognitive maps that Sellars builds on. So Tolman has this 1932 book called Purposive Behavior in Animals and Men. And he is writing about purpose and goal-directedness, leaning on work by Ralph Barton Perry, an early 20th century Harvard philosopher. He has a book, his paper is what? Purpose and Cognition, I believe it is. It's like a massive paper from like 1910. And Perry was sort of, part of the legacy of William James and Josiah Royce in that grand tradition. He's one of Tolman's teachers and passes on to Tolman this idea of taking teleology seriously and goal-directedness seriously. Tolman is very, he's very tongue-in-cheek. He's very dry, bit of a dry wit. He refers to Watsonian behaviorism as muscle twitchism. Like you're not just, the Watson just wants to set up, SR reactions in a very mechanistic way. And that's not Tolman. And it's not Sellars, right? I think it's Sellars' project, given he says about behavior, and given he talks about behavior in terms of being pattern governed, in terms of behavior as involving some kind of reliable interactions with the environment, I don't think that even makes any sense, philosophically speaking, without taking teleology much more seriously than he himself did. And I think that's a big part of why cybernetics is appealing to me, as well as autopoiesis, the biological autonomy thesis that Morena and Mosio have been developing, some of the work that DiPaolo has been doing in the Sensible Life Project. I think that's all very interesting work that has to be taken seriously for the Sellarsian project to really work. I think one reason why Sellars doesn't really see it that way is because at the time Sellars is writing, in the 50s and 60s, organismal biology was basically absent. And the modern synthesis brought together sub-organismal biology focused on genes with supra-organismal biology focused on ecology. That was that was the breakthrough of population genetics. And organisms just aren't taken very seriously anymore. So when he's doing biology, he's taking biology seriously, or trying to, but at a time when organismal biology was at its nadir in the States. And with organismal biology at its nadir, there's no community of biologists who are taking teleology seriously. Fortunately, that's no longer the case. Fortunately, because of the impact of cybernetics has evolved into very interesting projects. Right, with was it Rosen and his Life Itself project, which some of his deep cybernetic roots. All the stuff that we see coming out of the various people in Italian schools. We see now a time when philosophy of biology has made its way back to taking organisms and teleology seriously. And I think that's very exciting for us as philosophers and computer scientists and theoreticians. I also think it also gives me the tools that I need now to make sense of what Sellars was trying to gesture at in the 50s and 60s.
So if I can come in, because we're conscious of time, and there's a lot of people haven't said anything yet, which is quite unusual in one of these sessions. Is there anybody else got to wave their hand around that wants to come in? I've got a couple of questions that are bubbling in my mind, if not. So I'm not seeing any hands coming up at the moment. This is sort of interesting stuff. So and I guess this works for both Joe and Carl as something to start to tackle. I see your hand, David. we've talked a lot about creating, we use, and this is a sort of propositional question really, rather than a statement, we seem to use language in the shape of words, or language in the shape of pictures, and pictures are just as much a language for me as words are, to articulate to other people in our environment the way that we are observing the world. But the words and pictures are artifacts that enable us to externalize what's going on in our brains, rather than facts of existence. So when you talk about the sort of the picturing was one of the words that you used. Does our brain create pictures? Are pictures real, or are they just ways of us projecting what we've observed of the world, because we have no other adequate mechanism for doing so? That's a genuine question.
I guess that's mostly towards me, or Joe.
Either or both.
I'll give a quick answer, and then Carl can give a cleverer answer. I mean, so I would certainly go for the latter side of what you just suggested there. So I don't think there's anything like pictures going on in the head, as it were. I tend to think of all of these linguistic pronouncements as being where anything even close to picturing comes in. What you might get though is something like internalized language. So it could be that some of what you do is kind of talking to yourself, and then that's maybe a little closer to picturing insofar as you're having this kind of conversation with yourself. But I think it gets things around the wrong way to think that there are first and we try to put them into words. Wherever I think there's internal processes going on which produce words, and then those maybe lead to something closer to picturing.
No, it sort of puts me in mind of the going back to the robot that Carl was talking about. I'm thinking, I observe. I like to, maybe I'm arrogant. I like to think that I observe my own interactions with the world. So I'm both observing my world and observing myself, observing my world, and using language as a mechanism for describing what I've chosen to believe is going on, as in what I've chosen to find observable about the world that I'm in. None of which is necessarily factual, because I've chosen to see what I've chosen to see, informed by all the things that I think I've seen before, and all the things that I want to see in the world that surround me. Carl, have you got a thought?
Well, but I certainly think that picturing, I think the relation between, I think that for us, for humans, picturing is very much shaped by culture, and as well as by personal history. Picturing can be very much shaped by ideology, right? So, you can perceive a situation as fearful or familiar based on all sorts of biases, assumptions, heuristics, culturally laden images of all sorts. So that's certainly true. But I want to take picturing in a very, very liberal sense to be a theory of animal cognition. I think that's how Sellars means it, and I think that is how I want to take it up as well. So Sellars says multiple times in his work, a very simple case of picturing would be honeybee wiggle dances, right? When honeybees give their wiggles and waggles to illustrate, to convey the direction and distance of pollen, of nectar, that's picturing. So picturing is rampant throughout the animal world. It's how organisms share information, and it happens. Birds do it, bees do it, right? Picturing is not just something that human beings engage in. What is interesting about human beings is that we are not solitary pictures, but rather that we use language in how we picture, right? We can have collective pictures that are collective by virtue of culture, language, religion, ethnicity, generation, popular culture, entertainment, and so on. And we have managed to figure out how to institute a series of social practices that allow us to rigorously test our pictures and correct them. And that's what science is.
Okay, so that's right. So I'm going to have to move on because there's a bunch of hands waving around. So we'll need to move to another question. So what I've got in my head coming out of that is effectively what you describe as picturing in B is you know, is their mechanism for communication. So they create the picture in order to communicate, and that's you know that's sort of quite convenient.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say, but I don't want to call it create. I want to say because they are reliably tracking regularities in their environment. Right? It's not, their picturing is not simply projecting a painting onto a blank canvas.
Okay.
But that the picturing does involve the kind of interactions between brains and the environment that the enactivists have been talking about.
Yeah, that's cool. So they're giving instructions, for want of a better way of putting it at this point. David, over to you at this point, please. Put your hand up. You're on mute. You're still on mute, David.
Sorry, I left around the screen there. Hopefully you can hear me now. Okay, so thanks both of you very much for that. I took far more notes than usual because I know it's going to take me some time to digest all of this. I've only got 4 questions, so just riff around on whatever you feel minded to. It seems to me that you both had a kind of discussed dual approaches or ideas about understanding or sensing. My first question would be, both of you, you know, what goblet-sized corollaries do you see emerging from the approach that you've described, or where do you think you might come next? What might emerge? I notice you both at various times use the phrase either folk psychology or folk science, like different, where do these folk accounts come from as opposed to our scientific accounts? Is this part of what we're talking about? There's also what attracted me very much about 20-30 years ago is a distinction between implicit and explicit knowledge of moderately complicated systems. Diane Berry did some lovely stuff on simulations of sugar factories and so forth, and people's capacity to sort of maintain them within certain bounds was negatively correlated with their ability to talk about what they were doing. Rather like a pupil of mine who was very good at table tennis was surprised that he beat me because I was supposed to know about angles. And I suppose the last thing that this sort of touches on is the hard problem, raw fields, and so on. How close are you taking us towards that, or do we just not talk about that now because it annoys some people?
So just on the last one, I was very much trying to avoid consciousness and the hard problem and so on, and often do. But it does relate a little bit to what John was asking about, insofar as I think this idea that we have something like pictures in the head really has a lot to do with consciousness. So insofar as I don't want to talk about consciousness, I don't want to talk about why it seems like we might have a picture in the head anyway, because I think that's kind of the same problem in some ways. I'll just say one thing kind of about the first two points there. So psychology, the way I think about representational theories of mind, so thinking of the mind as picturing or representing, I tend to think of that as more of a folk psychological thing. So we introspect on our own thinking and on what other people are thinking, and it's quite natural to think of it in these kind of picturing or representing terms. But what I would say I take as a kind of a takeaway from cybernetics and the more kind of mechanistic approaches is that it might be useful to keep that somewhat separate from what's actually going on in the head. So there could be systems which produce behavior which looks like it's conscious or picturing or representing or something, but actually is just gears turning or something like this. And those might be two very different domains. And that relates a little bit to this idea of the scientific and the manifest image from Sellars actually as well, which Carl was talking about at the end there. I'll hand over to Carl on that note.
Yeah. So Carl, just so you're aware, we've got about 13 minutes, and I've got at least 2 more questions coming in. So brief answers, please.
I'll try. I don't know what to say about consciousness. I have nothing to say about it. I mean, philosophically, it's very interesting. I guess I'm not convinced it's a hard problem, but I'm also not convinced it's an easy problem. I just don't really know what to say about it. And I guess, as far as, folk psychology, like insofar as we think of ourselves as believers, as knowers, as judgers, and so on. I suppose my view on that is sort of in between what, a Dennett kind of view and a Churchland kind of view. I think Joe has a similar kind of, in similar kind of terrain. Like we find it very useful to talk about others this way. We find it very useful to talk about ourselves in this vocabulary. Does it really matter what's going on at the neurocomputational level? No. I mean, not necessarily, maybe to some extent, but not really. But I think the only real difference between my view and Joe's at this point is that I think of picturing as a neurocomputational mechanism. So I don't see picturing as what's going on at the linguistic socio-cultural level. I see picturing what's happening at the neurocomputational level. I think that part of what's confusing about Sellars is that he uses this particular word to convey the neurocomputational level he's trying to bring into view.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Malcolm, you've had your hand up, I think, and then followed by Margaret.
Okay, yeah, following on really, I suppose, from what Carl just said, because that kind of preempts some of it, but John, you triggered a train of thought just a few moments ago, where in referring to your description of, picturing and observing it, so it's not kind of like a passive photographic plate, but as a constructive process of building something. And that kind of makes me think of Anil Seth's idea of controlled hallucinations. Now, of course, Joe was about to talk about Anil Seth, but ran out of time. And in view of the fact that Anil Seth even popped up on the Google Groups sitcom discussion board recently, I just wonder if Joe or Carl has got any more views to elaborate on Seth and cybernetics.
Yeah. So when Carl was talking about actually that idea of in Sellars of this kind of constructed picturing, that to me as well sounded a lot like Seth's work and like the predictive processing framework more generally, as Carl said. This idea of controlled hallucination. So I worry that this takes too literally this idea of an internal picture basically, and sets up this kind of barrier between us and the world. So I think it's certainly true that insofar as we're usefully described as having these pictures, they're going to be constructed ones. I'm just not sure it's wise to take that quite so literally. Maybe it's a good way for us to model or make sense of the kind of complex interactions between inputs and internal mechanisms. And then, whether or not that's real is going to be a further question about how seriously we take the contents of those scientific models. So this takes us maybe more into broader questions about scientific modeling and what those even are. So that's what I'd say about that. I just worry that it kind of reifies this boundary between us and the world, basically.
Thanks, Joe. And Carl.
What Joe said seems right to me. I think it's only just sort of, I think that I like Joe's point about sort of this worried about sort of this misplaced reification. And I think there is room for a similar concerns about how stable picturing items are even going to be on a Sellarsian account, right? Because the more dynamic and interactive they are to make them seem more realistic, more plausible, the less they have the kind of stability and re-identifiability over time that we think of the word representation even requires. So I think there are worries I need to have here in order to make the Sellarsian view work that I think are very similar to what Joe's worries about Seth.
Thank you. And Margaret, you're on mute temporarily.
Yes. Okay. There we go. So my question has to do, if you had to take a Sellars thesaurus out and use different words that he's used for picturing, what would those words be, those concepts or ideas be in Sellars' alternate thesaurus?
That's a nice question. If I had to translate Sellars into English.
Using the thesaurus, so you could use every word except picturing.
So I would probably want to call it second order structural representations, using the kind of idea that Paweł Glasziewski has been developing. Or you could think of it as mapping. Sellars himself actually uses those two words interchangeably. It's a question whether he's entitled to, but I can tell you that he does. Or you could just say, I would just cash it out as feedback loop driven computational mechanisms.
So that just one final word, bringing us back actually to some cybernetics. That kind of idea reminds me a bit of Ashby's good regulator theorem. So even if you don't think there's any real representation or picturing going on, this idea of structural similarity, I think, is really going to come out here. So insofar as Ashby's right about this, and any good control system has to come to resemble structurally the system that it's controlling, that might get you something less strongly representational sounding, but it's still a structural similarity.
I'm sorry, Margaret?
Yeah, just wondered if terminology like state space structuring or state space patterning would ever be useful as an alternative.
Oh, certainly. Oh, certainly. Abstract. I mean, I think that, I think that, for example, the only the major philosopher who picks up Sellars on picturing and runs with it is Paul Churchland in his state space semantics. Like, what Churchland does in his work is very Sellarsian, and is this dimension of Sellars that most people don't pick up on. One could run with it along those lines very, very easily, no question.
I'm going to.
I think that there's. Please.
No, it's fine. I got a sense that this could go on for quite some time if we were to allow it to. But being disciplined cyberneticians, if such a thing actually exists, we like to start more or less on time and finish more or less on time. I've been gripped, and like David, I've written about 7 pages of notes, and I look forward to watching the videos and working out what was actually said during the course of this, as opposed to the things that I thought I wrote down, which are sort of probably very different. One thing I did put down in the middle, of course, is that sort of when we describe the world through language, which was one of your comments, Carl, as we were coming on, I was reminded that in Alice in Wonderland it says, Humpty Dumpty paid his words extra to make them mean what he chose, but he couldn't change the nature of the things that they described. And I think there's something really, really interesting and powerful in playing with and comprehending, as Margaret's just done, teasing us, if you like, with different approaches to the language that we use to describe the world that for me, we sort of kind of co-create the world with the environment around us, which is always fun. Gentlemen, extraordinary. Thank you very much. That's been really, really interesting and stimulating. We will tidy up the video and get it onto YouTube as soon as possible and let you know when that is done, everybody.